Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, liberation of views incense, cloud of lighted incense pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, and future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent three treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattva, as Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great vow, Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastamaprana Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. Good morning. So just a couple of things before we get started. I typed them already, but services are not starting back at White Sands as we had discussed, I think probably last week. And so still live streaming these, and also Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. on YouTube, and Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. on Zoom. So if you want information about those, just email me. I'll give you the Zoom link so you can join us for Zoom. And you know, I like it when you ask questions here during these talks, but it's a little hard to have a conversation just because of the whole lag issue. So, you know, anytime you've got questions about anything, you want to have a discussion about something, feel free to come to those Zoom meetings. It's easier to do. DeLand, I'm waiting to find out when the church is going to reopen. So I don't know. I realized recently that a lot of the people attending my online meetings are female. In fact, I don't know for sure who comes to the YouTube meetings. I guess the Zoom meetings, a lot of them are about 50-50. But I lead a contemplative practice group online with some Stetson faculty and staff, and I'm usually the only guy in the virtual room. And it's occurred to me a number of times that women tend to be more spiritual, or at least more interested in spirituality than men. And so I think that's interesting. I think that's probably a good thing. But at any rate, once in a while, someone will ask me how Buddhism treats women. And I wish that there was an easy answer, and I wish that I could say that Buddhism was historically fair and equitable toward women, or at least I wish I could say that Buddhism treats women equitably today, but I can't really say that. As with most major religions, the relationship between Buddhism and gender is kind of complicated because there's been a lot of historical things that happened in different cultures at different times, and still, America's not a Buddhist culture. The West is not generally Buddhist, and Asian cultures come, with whatever baggage they bring. So when you're studying a religion, any religion, there's kind of two approaches. There's the devotional process, where you're studying scriptures and teachings in order to build and deepen your relationship to the sacred. And so that's mostly what we're doing when we have these meetings and when I give Dharma talks and stuff, is really learning about the religion in order to practice the religion, in order to deepen your relationship to the sacred, whatever that means to you. And then there's the religious studies approach, where you're trying to learn about a religion, but kind of free from your own emotional or spiritual involvement with it. So when I talk about something like this, I kind of have to try to straddle that line, which is not easy to do. Um, and but my intention is to expand understanding of Buddhism for both Buddhists and non-Buddhists. And so hopefully as we go through this together, we'll come away with something that um, will help you kind of get the historical sense of this and determine how to function within Buddhism, within your own Buddhism. You don't have to follow a Buddhism that someone else gives to you, spoon feeds you or whatever. In fact, it's really impossible to do that. Even if you were practice something very, very traditional and went to the right temples and followed the right teachings, still our relationship to religion, if we're doing anything meaningful with it at all, is our relationship to religion. So it's very individual and personal and intimate, unless you're just looking at it as a museum piece, which is kind of pointless anyway. So when we look at religion, whether it's our religion or someone else's religion, we tend to think that we have kind of what you might consider a God's eye view. The average person probably thinks that their particular religion is, absolute and eternal, and it's always been this way. And so consequently, we have this feeling that, I heard a religious studies teacher once talk about it, that we think we see our religion, we see everything from nowhere. But in reality, we experience religion with sort of situatedness. We can only see what we can see from a particular place and time. And so I can't stand here and see what's happening outside except through certain windows, and I can't tell what's going to happen here tomorrow, and I can't see yesterday. I can see my memories of yesterday, but I can't really see yesterday. So when you hear a statement like Buddhism is a peaceful religion, or Christianity is conservative, or Islam encourages violence, or something like that, these are all generalizations that are based on what someone may have seen from their particular perspective, which may or may not be accurate from other perspectives. And in fact, I'd say almost by definition, what we see from our perspective is not accurate from other perspectives. Different people see these things different ways. So, and that's really all we can do. So for a more realistic view, we kind of have to broaden our perspective. Excuse me. And when we do that, we see that there's diversity from one religion to another, but there's also diversity within individual religions. So not all religious beliefs are anywhere near as eternal as they may seem. They change over time as cultures evolve. Religion creates culture, but religion is also influenced by culture. It's kind of a feedback loop. And so we find this sort of ongoing condition where religion and culture are influencing one another, and both are changing and evolving. So Buddhism arose within a particular culture in northern India, and Indian society was largely defined by this Brahmanistic view, which included things like the caste system. And so the prevailing view during the Buddhist time was that social class was the result of karma and was unchangeable. And so if you had good karma from a previous existence, you might get to be born a male in a higher caste. That was, the result of really good karma. If you had bad karma, you could be born in a lower caste and you might be born female. I'm not saying I agree with this. So if you're a female or a male who's, likes women, and you feel that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, I feel that too as I say this. So I'm not saying I agree with this, but basically some people felt that women were women because they'd done something bad in a previous existence. And this perhaps helped justify or at least rationalize the sort of general marginalization of women that happened in that society, and it still to some extent does. This was not universal because there were diverse religious sects, including Jainism, but for the most part, women were included in religious instruction and might have been barred from entering temples and things like that. Priests were, for the most part, male. We can see from the Buddhist discourses that generally speaking, he didn't particularly agree with or have a lot of value for the Brahmanistic views. And he and his followers would argue against some of these ideas, but he was kind of diplomatic. He didn't argue with people who were not open to change. And that makes sense because it's, go out and argue with somebody who's diametrically opposed to your point of views and are really hung up on their position. And, you're wasting your time and theirs too to try to argue with it. So when it comes to women and the Buddha, things get a little sticky. And you can see from several discourses, though, that he felt that women were not inferior to men, spiritually or otherwise. But he was cautious and maybe even personally conflicted. I mean, we don't know. So I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar here. We're dealing with issues of gender and Buddhism in the West. And I sometimes encounter conflicts between my own Buddhist practice and point of view and some of the cultural manifestations of Buddhism that appear. And I probably, if I were a Christian, I would also be experiencing similar clashes between my point of view and some of the points of view of other Christians that I would encounter. So I've had different affiliations with different Buddhist traditions. And so in Bright Dawn, the minister training I did, gender issues are non-existent, basically. There's no distinction made on the basis of gender. And so there's non-honor meetings in DeLand and things like that, where I'm a spiritual head. There's no distinction. At Stetson, where I'm a chaplain, there's a policy of inclusion. Gender is only an issue there, and the chaplains are expected to make an effort to be inclusive. But in some traditional Buddhist cultures, gender can be an issue. And this is probably a carryover from patriarchal cultures, but unfortunately there's some scriptural support for gender bias in Buddhism, but there are also spiritual arguments against it. So there's a lot of contradiction within the canonical texts. So once in a while, I find myself in this sort of uncomfortable position of having to walk this careful line between my cultural point of view and my own practice, which are both inclusive and egalitarian, and the cultural preconceptions around me and in a particular context. So, for example, my first ordination was in the Thai order. They don't even ordain women in that order anymore. There used to be, just long story short, there is an effort to reestablish the women's order in Theravada Buddhism, and so it started to appear. But for a long time, there were no women's Theravada orders. But let me give you an example of how early Buddhists dealt with Brahmanism, and maybe that'll give you some context. So I'm going to use some verses written by a Buddhist nun that I think are really beautiful and kind of clever. So this nun, Punyaka, is recounting a conversation that she had with a Brahmin. So the Brahmins, that was the priest caste. So that was the highest caste because they were the closest to God. They were born from the purest karma. And Punyaka sees this Brahmin going to the water all the time. And she says she used to go down to the water out of fear of beatings from her employer. So that was the way she would escape, get out from under her employer's eye before she was a nun. And so she asked him, what is it you're afraid of that you go down to the water even on cold mornings when you're going down there and shivering and bathing? And the Brahmin said, well, surely you know. You're asking one doing skillful karma and warding off evil. Whoever, young or old, does water ablution, water bathing from a ritual purpose, is set free from evil karma. And the nun said, well, who taught you that? Through water ablution, one is freed from evil karma. In that case, they'd all go to heaven, all these frogs and turtles and serpents and crocodiles and anything else that lives in the water. Which, if you think about it, that's pretty astute. If a Brahmin bathing in the water was going to wash away his evil karma, well, crocodiles and fish and everything would all go to heaven, right? And she says, not only that, but people who slaughter animals and thieves and executioners and any other evil doer could be set free from negative rebirth simply by bathing in the river. And she said, and if you think about it, if rivers could carry off your evil karma that you've done in the past, why wouldn't they carry off your meritorious karma as well? which is an interesting thought. If bathing off in the river washes away the results of negative actions, why wouldn't it wash away the results of the good that I've done? So having considered what she says, this Brahmin tells her that maybe he's been following the wrong path. She's making a lot of sense. So in gratitude, he offers to give her his robe. She refuses it. She says, I don't need that. She says, if you're afraid of pain, don't do any evil karma, whether in open or in secret. And if you're afraid of pain, go to the awakened one for refuge, go to the Dharma and Sangha and take the precepts, and that will lead to your liberation. And so the Brahmin does this. He goes for refuge, and he says, when he goes for refuge, he says something interesting. He said, before I was a kinsman to Brahmins, and now I'm truly a Brahmin. So the Buddha and his followers typically use reason to make converts. But I suspect that nun knew that priest was ready to hear that. She wasn't arguing with somebody that she didn't think was ready to hear what she had to say. So the Buddha did ordain women, obviously, since Punyaka was ordained. And he had some very interesting relationships with several of them. And I think that had a profound influence on the way the Dharma was taught and the way the Buddhist community formed. So you may recall the Buddha's own mother, when she was about to give birth, left the palace to go back to her family home, which was the custom in India at the time. And she reached a fruit tree grove and she stopped to rest, and she gave birth under the shade of a flowering tree. And unfortunately, her health took a bad turn after his birth, and so she died shortly afterward. And the Buddha was raised by her sister, Mahapajapati. After the Buddha's enlightenment, he visited his birthplace, and a lot of his relatives became followers. His stepmother, Mahapajapati, asked for ordination, but he refused. She didn't give up. She followed him barefooted back to the monastery where he was planning to stay for the rains. And she asked for ordination twice more, but he kept saying no. Well, his cousin Ananda, who was his right-hand companion, saw her outside the gates with her feet swollen from walking barefooted so far. She was covered head to toe in dust, and the dust on her face was streaked with tears. And she explained that she had asked 3 times for permission to establish an order of bhikkhunis, of nuns, and 3 times the Buddha had refused. And so Ananda went and asked the Buddha, he said, why don't you ordain your stepmother? And he said no. And then he asked the Buddha, well, isn't a woman capable of becoming fully enlightened? An arahant, in other words. And the Buddha said, well, yeah, there's no reason she couldn't do that. So Ananda argued, if a woman could become an arahant, wouldn't it unfair to refuse to ordain her? And he also brought up the reasons the Buddha had to be grateful to his stepmother. She had raised him from infancy and fed him and everything. And he said, wouldn't that be a good reason to help her gain liberation? In other words, if it's possible for her to become enlightened, and it's more possible for her to become enlightened if she ordains, then don't you kind of owe it to her? And the Buddha said, well, yeah, I see your point. And so he agreed to ordain her. He put extra requirements on nuns, and there's some commentaries that said that he felt that accepting women into the order was going to create problems. There would be conflicts and problems that might even ultimately shorten the life of Buddhism. But in order to kind of help with this, he made sure that the women got the best possible teachers. So the monks of only the highest virtue and accomplishment could teach women. And so it's important to him that they get the best instruction possible. There are a couple of incidents involving King Pasenadi that kind of help us understand how the Buddha felt toward women. At one time, Pasenadi was upset because one of his wives had born a child, but instead of the male heir that he was hoping for, she had had a daughter. And the Buddha said, no, be happy about that. So daughters can grow up to be intelligent, virtuous people. Pasenadi had several wives, and they wanted to learn the Dharma too, but as the king's wives, they were pretty much confined to the palace. And so they went to the king and said, could you ask the Buddha to send a monk to the palace to teach us the Dharma? And so the king asked, well, which monk do you think would be most acceptable? And they asked for Ananda, who was the Buddha's best teacher. And the Buddha agreed, and so from then on, Ananda was the one who taught the Dharma to the king's wives. There's a collection of writings called the Therigatha, which consists of verses attributed to 73 women who became elder nuns, and many of them, including Mahapajapati, were fully enlightened, were arahants. And some of these poems are really wonderful. There's several that point to the kinds of suffering from which these women wanted to become unbound. It was kind of groundbreaking that the Buddha ordained women because it wasn't widely accepted in India. There were, though, already women who left the material world for the religious life. I mentioned the Jains earlier. The Jain order of nuns was in place already. And one Jain nun named Bada became a Buddhist after meeting with Sariputta, who was one of the key disciples. Talked about Sariputta a couple of weeks ago, I think. And after a religious discussion, she and Sariputta were so impressed with one another that he took her to meet the Buddha. And she was enlightened after only a short conversation with the Buddha. She became an arahant. And she became one of the few nuns who was already an arahant when she entered the order. There's a lovely poem by Patachara who talks about the moment she became enlightened. And it's really beautiful. She had lost her entire family, and it's a really tragic story. But she lost her husband and 2 small children and her parents and her brothers in accidents over the course of a few days. And she had basically lost her mind with grief. But the Buddha had helped her regain her sanity, and so she had ordained and become a nun. And one day, as she was washing her feet, she was watching the water trickle away, and she realized the truth of life, and she was suddenly enlightened. And she wrote this poem, "Washing my feet, I noticed the water, and in watching it flow from high to low, my heart was composed like a fine steed. And then taking a lamp, I entered my hut, checked the bedding, sat down on the bed. Taking the pen, I pulled out the wick. Like the flames unbinding was the liberation of awareness." So I could unpack that, but it's just so beautiful on its own that I'm just going to kind of leave that with you. So you might expect that Buddhism influenced women's conditions in cultures where it appeared, and it does seem to have had a generally positive effect. It's hard to tell to what extent, but there's a psychologist or sociologist, I think, named Dewa Raja, who did extensive research on the subject of women in Buddhism from a historical perspective and presented this back in the 1970s and 1980s. She was a senior lecturer at the University of Colombo, which was the oldest university, is still probably the oldest university in Sri Lanka. And she looked at what had been written by European visitors in Southeast Asia over the time, and these writers had visited in the 19th century, mostly before the West had much effect on the culture there, and found that there was some ambivalence toward women, but their position was better in Buddhist countries than in surrounding countries that were not Buddhist. And so she felt that what she called the universal ideology of masculine superiority of all the cultures that she considered conflicts with the Buddhist ethics. But because of the influence of Buddhism, women in Sri Lanka and so on had greater rights regarding things like marriage and divorce and property ownership. So while women in that part of the world were hardly equal, their situation was better than in places that were not Buddhist. Most of the prominent Dharma teachers throughout history have been male, so Buddhism may not be much different than other religions in that respect. But this is changing. A lot of Western Buddhists assume that this change comes about as a result from influence from more progressive Western culture, but that's not entirely true. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But there are contemporary efforts to make relations more fair. And things like the Me Too movement has affected Buddhist organizations. There's a large, prominent Tibetan Buddhist organization that recently issued a statement that it was responding to accusations of sexual abuse by creating a process for investigating them and making sure that these things are taken seriously. And other organizations have similarly reacted strongly to allegations of abuse. So I think you can see the seeds of gender equity uh, have been planted a long time ago. Um, I'm a monk I ordained in the Soto Zen school. And one of the key reasons that I ordained in that school is that Dogen Zenji, the master who founded that school, um, had a very kind of unique view of gender and equality. So this goes back to the 13th century. And in his collected writings, he talked at length once in favor of equal treatment of women in the Sangha, in a fairly major essay. And he wrote, "What is so exalted about a man? Space is space, the four elements are the four elements. For a woman, it's the same thing. All acquire the Dharma equally. All should pay homage to and hold in esteem one who has acquired the Dharma. Do not make an issue of whether it's a man or a woman." And during the remainder of the essay, he systematically pokes holes in the various rationalizations used to justify holding women as inferior in the practice halls of Japan. Ideas like fear and hatred of women because they were objects of desire. He points out that men may also be objects of sexual attraction. It says impure acts have been committed because of an image reflected in the water. Impure acts have been committed because of the sun and the heavens. Gods, demons, and dreamlike phantoms may be objects of sexual attraction. It is impossible to count the number of causes that can precipitate lust, he says. So how could you possibly not look at any of them? And as for this idea of women being women because of past negative karma, he basically says, so what? He said, if you despise people because they've committed offenses in the past, then you should despise every bodhisattva. If you despise people because they will likely commit offenses in the future, you should also despise bodhisattvas who have their mind set on realizing Buddhahood. And then you will forsake everyone, and how then will the Buddha Dharma be realized? So when I saw that, I felt I was really impressed by that. Thank you for listening. I'm going to look and see. It looks like I've had a couple of questions. So let me see what your questions or comments are. Laura is asking about the timeline for DeLand meetings. I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll repeat it. So on YouTube, Wednesdays at 7 p.m., live streaming just like on Sunday mornings. And then on Zoom at 6. The Zoom meetings really were scheduled because I was going to Palm Coast sometimes and meeting at 6 there at the library. So I scheduled them at 6. So Star is asking if both scientists and Buddhists can agree on one thing. What can that be? I think scientists and Buddhists actually probably agree on a lot. I once saw the Dalai Lama speak. I think it was an interview he gave, and somebody asked him a similar question, and he said that that the Buddha had said that where science and Dharma conflicted, you should go with science. I've never actually seen that, so I'm not sure what he was talking about. But the thing is, science and Buddhism a lot of times deal in different realms, right? So science is concerned with physical phenomena in a way that Buddhism sometimes isn't. But you see a lot of overlap between like contemporary science having to do with neurology and psychology and things like that, and what Buddhism has taught. And so you see a lot of researchers now looking into the effect that meditation has on the brain and that sort of thing. And there's a very interesting guy who's an evolutionary psychologist. His name is Robert Reich, I think. Maybe it's right. I have to look and see it, and I can't remember the name of the book now. But I'll try to remember to mention this in another Dharma talk. And if you come to Zoom on Thursday, remind me, and I'll figure it out. But he talks about kind of the neural networks that light up and that kind of thing, and the idea of meditation and the self and not self, and the truth of dukkha and stuff. And he explains those things in really interesting scientific ways. So I think there's a lot that science and Buddhism would agree on. Buddhism is based on the idea of cause and effect. You do good, you get a good result. You do bad, you get a bad result. In Buddhism, we don't say, well, here's the 10 things you have to believe. Believe this because we tell you so. The Buddha said, see for yourself if this is true. So it's kind of empirical in a lot of ways. So I don't think there's just one thing that science and Buddhism would agree on. I think it's quite a bit. So I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much for being here. And I hope to see you, or hope that you will join me again on Wednesday or Thursday. And in the meantime, let me know if there's any way that I can help you with your practice. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind. Great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Shakyamuni Buddha, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, to the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma, and their relations throughout space and time, for all ancestors of this Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved in the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized, and may they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for those suffering from violence and those who grieve for them, for those living in oppression, for all who are in prison who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, and catastrophe, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of all those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We pray for all those suffering from COVID-19, those working to protect and treat them, and to those grieving for those lost to this pandemic. At this time, we have members of our congregations, friends, and loved ones suffering from disease and who are grieving for losses. We pray for them and send loving thoughts their way. May they all be serene through their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. Sabbe sata sadahantu avera sukha jivino katang punya phalang maihang sabbe bhagi bhavantu te. May all beings always live happily, free from animosity. May all share in the blessings that spring from the good we have done. Three bows. And we bow to each other. And thank you, and I'll see you again soon.